In 2012, Sandy began as a little disturbance somewhere in the open seas. But soon she grew to the point where she caught the attention of the National Weather Service. She grew from what was initially described as a little disturbance to a tropical depression, then a tropical storm, and then to a full-fledged hurricane. And as she grew, people in the know started to predict that her path was heading directly towards Florida and that it could run all the way up the East Coast. It really didn't take long before the weather folks started talking about a huge storm of possible biblical proportions hitting the East Coast around New York and New Jersey. Well, that morning, the American TV show Good Morning America interviewed New Yorkers who thought that all the storm talk was just being hyped up. And part of the reason that they didn't believe it was because they had heard it all before. A very similar, overhyped hurricane, this one named Irene, turned out to be a non-event in New York. And because of that, there were just a lot of the people that were skeptical. And that's why one New York City family blew off the warnings to evacuate their house and their neighborhood. In fact, this dad was interviewed that morning as saying this. It says, the wind may be strong, the noise, the sound, but I don't really think it will be as bad as they say it's going to be. And many of the other residents of that community were in harm's way as well. And they made the same decision and decided to simply ride it out. And they had a choice, didn't they? They could listen to the experts or they could risk it. And you have to admit that people may scoff at the Weather Center's predictions by saying that really they don't know what's going to happen and they're only really guessing at best. But we need to remember that forecasters are often right. You know, the movie The Perfect Storm was based on a real storm that killed a lot of real people. Thousands of people failed to heed the warnings about Hurricane Katrina. That's the one that devastated the Gulf Coast in 2005. And it became one of the 5 deadliest storms ever in the U.S. history. As it relates to Sandy, the New York City mayor at that time, Mayor Bloomberg, told the city's residents that, and I quote, if you refuse to evacuate, you're not only putting yourself at risk, but also the first responders, who will have to put their lives at risk trying to rescue you if you should need it. And in spite of all the warnings, there were a lot of people who thought that they knew better or were willing to take that risk. Well, when it was all said and done, Hurricane Sandy was labeled as Superstorm Sandy, actually a level above a hurricane. And when the sun started to rise the next day, New Yorkers came out of their homes to find submerged neighborhoods, water-soaked electrical equipment, an estimated $200 billion in damage, 233 deaths, and this little disturbance, as it was initially labeled, had impact on 24 states. And the storm that many chose to ignore would have an impact on people's lives for years and years to come. And again, it's not that the people weren't warned, right? People heard the warning and many just simply chose to ignore it. And with all of the circumstances that surround these types of natural disasters, there are always going to be people who ignore the warnings, and there are always people who find themselves ill-prepared when the storm eventually does hit them. And that story reminds me of the cautionary tale from Matthew chapter 14. If you have your Bibles with you, I'm going to invite you to turn to that chapter with me. Now, keep in mind that as we walk into this story, that Jesus has just fed the 5,000 with 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. And the people who had been there for that miracle were eager to make Jesus their king or their political leader. I wonder if Jesus wasn't somewhat concerned that the disciples would embrace that idea too. So he made the decision to send them away. But as we're about to find out, he sends them right into a storm. You know, storms can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and different forms, can't they? They seem to come at the most inopportune moments. These storms show up when your home is in order and flowing on calm water, but then all of a sudden your spouse starts acting like a fool. These storms show up right after your child gets an award for some high achievement, and then out of the blue, they start acting like someone you've never met before. Storms show up when your supervisor starts to act like he or she is out to get you. One day you and your spouse are feeling great, ready to take on the world together, and then you get an unexpected call from the doctor. And when these storms show up, my question is, what do you do? And it's not like Scripture hasn't prepared us for these storms, right? And in the passage that we're unpacking this morning, Jesus had been trying to tell his disciples that if they were going to call themselves a follower of his, then they should expect the storms to come. And it's not as if he hadn't prepared them for that, right? And in this particular encounter, Jesus had told his disciples to get into a boat and to go ahead of him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee is known for its storms, and they are created as the winds sweep down the surrounding mountains, and one of these storms was about to hit. Scholars tell us that this event likely occurred the time of the Passover in mid-April. So that meant that there would have been a full moon that night, and that becomes significant a little later. In fact, if you have your Bibles with you, this is what we read in Matthew 14, starting at verse 22. Matthew writes this: "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it." And I love reading the Gospel of Matthew because one of the things that makes this perspective so unique is that Matthew is writing to predominantly a Jewish audience. And a devout Jew understands that a rabbi's solitude time was considered to be very sacred back then. And you pick up on this even in how Matthew describes this particular situation. So we learned in these verses that Jesus was highly motivated to get away from people. And we're told that immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and to go on ahead of him. We're told that as soon as he had dismissed them, he went up to the mountainside by himself to pray. And he follows that up with, later that night, he was there alone. And again, you get the impression from Matthew that Jesus, although he was fully and completely engaged with these people that he was ministering to, that he was also trying to move things along so that he could go up to the mountainside to pray and to be by himself. You also come to understand in these verses that when Jesus told the disciples to get into the boat, that the waters were, at that moment, very calm. But somewhere, sometime, and somehow, a contrary wind came against them. And I want you to grasp this, because the boat that Jesus sent them out began to be tossed about. And that's precisely how storms happen, isn't it? Things usually start out looking really good. All was well and calm with the disciples in that boat. And then out of the blue, a storm hits. And this is the point where our story makes a bit of a shift. And again, keep in mind here that when the disciples leave the shore, they're doing what Jesus told them to do. So that means that everything's going to be smooth sailing for them, right? Well, that's not what happens. The disciples are obediently following the directions of their rabbi, and yet they still ran into this storm. And on a bit of a side note here, please note that when we look at the Bible all the way from Genesis right through to Revelation, we see this as a reoccurring pattern or a reoccurring theme. People of God have storms in their lives. Bad things do happen to good people. Tragedy shows no discrimination between those who follow Jesus and those who don't. So Matthew goes on and tells us this, that after fighting with these waves most of the night, that this is what happened. Verse 25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. Now, in ancient times, night was divided into what they called 4 watches: 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9 p.m. to midnight, 12 midnight to 3 a.m., and 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And since we're told that this miracle happened during the 4th watch, we know that Jesus went out onto the water to meet his disciples sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. And it's likely that as Jesus stood on the hillside in the light of the full moon, that he saw his disciples struggling and went to them in their time of need. And I really do love, again, what Matthew does here. And at a human level, this makes complete sense, doesn't it? Because one minute he's talking about these strong waves bashing against the side of the boat. And the next minute, the disciples are totally distracted by what they see coming towards them. One minute they're focused on their fear of drowning. And the next minute they're focused on their fear of what's coming their way. They were terrified and they cried out in fear. "It's a ghost," they said. "It can't be anything of this world because it goes against the laws of nature. Walking on the lake goes against the laws of gravity. It has to be something supernatural because things of this earth just can't walk on the water." And it's interesting that the disciples weren't confused or puzzled, but the passage is incredibly clear. They were terrified. The passage says that they cried out in fear. It's bad enough that they had this storm to contend with, but now even that wasn't the worst of their problems. It's bad enough that they were stuck in the middle of this lake, unable to control the direction of their boat. But now they had something horrifying that was coming towards them. And then Jesus does what he often does. He calms their fear. In verse 27, we read this. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." And I don't presume to know exactly what was going on in the disciples' heads at this particular moment. But I wonder if they had assumed that if it was Jesus telling them to get into the boat and to head across the water, that things would be safe. I wonder if they assumed that the waters would be calm and Jesus would simply meet them on the other side. A number of years ago, Monica had been out running some errands most of the day, and she got home around 3:30 or 4 p.m. She had asked me to run a couple of errands as well when she got back. We needed to drop something off at the post office, I think, and needed to pick up a couple things at Staples. And I agreed to do it when she got back home, and that's what I ended up doing. Well, to my surprise, about halfway to Staples, I ran out of gas. The tank was empty. I wonder how many of you can relate to this. And you should know that I am almost always the one that puts gas in our vehicle. But in that moment, I remember thinking to myself, if she knew that I needed to run these errands, is it not also fair to assume that she would have given me what I needed to do those errands? Or at least to have told me that we needed to put gas in the tank. But the answer to that is no. If it was my responsibility, she probably assumed that I would just look after it. But understand that I think we are that same way with God. Just because he asked us to travel down a certain road, or just because he asks us to take a certain job, or just because he asks us to do something for him, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be storms along the way. I think that Jesus' words to the disciples represented exactly what they needed to hear in that moment. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. But then we come to this next section of the story, and it's often the part of it that we focus on. Starting in verse 28, we walk into this dialogue that Jesus is having with Peter. And it goes like this, verse 28. "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. Verse 30. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Verse 31. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So what do you think is actually happening here? You probably, like me, have heard all kinds of messages and sermons on this particular passage, and often they focus on how it's true Peter was the only one that did get out of the boat. And yes, Jesus did correct Peter, but I wonder if this intense interaction took place for the benefit of the disciples. Because keep in mind that they were watching this whole scenario play out. They heard Jesus invite Peter to step out of the boat. They watched as Peter lifted his leg over the side of the boat to likely lower himself down. They watched as Peter's feet didn't sink into the water. And I wonder what was going on in their heads in that moment. I wonder if this wasn't yet another defining moment for them. Jesus said in the Gospel of John, "Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father." And we wonder, are those just words? Was Jesus just attempting to boost their confidence? I don't think so. He was telling them that whoever believes in him will do the works that he's been doing, and they will do even greater works than these. And here, Jesus isn't just telling them that with words, but he's showing them that with his actions. He's taking something that he was doing that left them terrified. It left them saying, "This is a ghost." It left them crying with fear. And now he's telling them that their mission is so important that they will be equipped with the power to do things that will leave other people terrified and wondering just how powerful this God is. I know that we've talked about this before, but it is interesting how often Jesus taught and then gave the listeners a visual illustration. He would teach them with words and then illustrate that truth with some sort of a tangible visual illustration. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here too. I mean, as much as we wish this weren't true, we really do learn how to follow Christ best when all of us are in the middle of working our way through a storm, don't we? Maybe it's because we have to trust him in those moments. And when the storms of life show us no mercy, the question that we often are guilty of asking is, well, why me? The question we should be asking is, Lord, what are you wanting to show me? Lord, what are you wanting to teach me through this? Lord, how can this storm deepen my faith and my relationship with you? And it's my prayer that as you have watched this morning, I know that there's many of you that are going through your own personal storms. I know that we've got within our congregation a number of people that have significant health concerns and issues that they are battling through. They've got storms that they are in the middle of. We've got people in our church that are struggling relationally, struggling financially. And maybe the question that we should be asking is not, Lord, why me? But maybe the question that we should be asking is, Lord, help me to learn what it is you want me to learn through this, so that when the storm is finished and the waters calm down again, you can use me in a way to touch the lives of other people.